February 1978, Sheremetyevo Airport, Moscow. The man stepping off the Aeroflot flight did not look like a spy. He was 32, wearing a conservative wool coat, carrying one suitcase, and moving carefully the way people do when they know they are being watched, even if they can't see who's watching. The Moscow air was sharp and dry, biting through fabric and skin. It smelled of jet fuel, cold concrete, and something metallic he couldn't quite place. His name, according to the passport in his pocket, was Michael Reynolds. Canadian. Technical translator. Toronto. That passport had already been checked once in the air. It would be checked again here, and again after that. He knew this because the people who sent him here had been very clear. Moscow was not a place where foreigners simply arrived. They were processed, logged, observed, remembered. The border control hall was silent in a way that felt deliberate. No unnecessary movement. No small talk. Just rows of uniformed officers, fluorescent lights, and the sound of stamps hitting paper with dull finality. When it was his turn, the officer did not look at him right away. He studied the passport slowly, page by page, as if searching for something invisible. Michael kept his expression neutral. Not confident, not afraid, just tired enough to be believable. He had practiced this moment hundreds of times. In a safe house thousands of miles away. In front of mirrors. Under questioning. Under pressure. None of that mattered now. This was real. The officer finally looked up. Their eyes met for less than a second. Then the stamp came down. Michael Reynolds was officially inside the Soviet Union. He did not relax. That would come later. Much later. Outside the terminal, Moscow stretched out in heavy gray layers. Wide roads, blocky buildings, snow pushed into dirty piles along the curb. It was not beautiful, but it was imposing. The kind of city that made you feel small on purpose. A government car was waiting. Not for him specifically, just a shared ride for foreign specialists assigned housing by the state. Still, he noted the license plate. He always noted the license plates. The apartment he was taken to was exactly as promised. One room, concrete walls, a narrow bed, a table, a radio, heat that worked when it felt like it, hot water that worked when it didn't. This, he had been told, was good, normal, unremarkable. That first night, he unpacked slowly. Too slowly, maybe. He placed his clothes in the wardrobe, lined his shoes neatly by the wall, and set his suitcase under the bed. Everything had its place. When he finally lay down, he did not sleep. Instead, he listened. Pipes knocking. Footsteps in the hallway. A door opening somewhere above him. A radio playing faintly through the wall. He reminded himself of the rules. Do not rush. Do not stand out. Do not assume you are safe. For the first 6 months, he would do nothing remarkable. No intelligence work. No meetings. No risks. Just existence. If he failed at that, if he drew attention too early, there would be no second chances. No dramatic escapes. No heroic endings. Only a knock on the door. And what happened after that, no one would ever be allowed to write down. Spring, autumn 1978. In Moscow, being ordinary was not a personality trait. It was a survival strategy. For the first 6 months, Michael Reynolds did nothing that could not be explained by boredom. He woke every morning at the same time, 7 o'clock, no earlier, no later. He exercised lightly, the kind of routine a health-conscious foreigner might follow after reading too many Western magazines. Push-ups, stretching, nothing obsessive, nothing impressive. Breakfast was always the same. Black bread, butter, tea, occasionally an egg, with a shop downstairs had them. Consistency mattered. Too much variety created questions. Too much discipline created suspicion. By 8:30, he left the apartment. He walked, never rushed. He took the same route to the metro, passed the same kiosk, nodded at the same woman selling newspapers. He learned her schedule before she learned his face. That mattered too. Moscow's metro was a world unto itself. Deep, echoing stations built like monuments. Trains arriving with mechanical precision, crowds moving in dense, efficient waves. He stood where everyone else stood. He read when everyone else read. He avoided eye contact without looking afraid. For Michael, every commute was a lesson. He learned which stations had uniformed police and which relied on plainclothes watchers. Which stairwells echoed differently. Which platforms had poor lighting. He learned how long people stared before looking away, and who stared too long. 3 days a week, he went to the Lenin Library. It was the perfect cover. Foreign specialists were expected to work there. Translators needed technical material. No one questioned a man sitting quietly for hours with notebooks and dictionaries. The reading rooms were vast and hushed, filled with engineers, academics, and government researchers hunched over journals. Michael read slowly. He took notes carefully, and while his hands worked, his eyes learned faces. Not who looked important, but who looked tired, who looked frustrated, who argued quietly with librarians, who returned books late and didn't seem to care. Those were the people worth remembering. He kept no lists. He never wrote names. Everything stayed in his head. In the afternoons, he did his actual job. The Translation Bureau sent him manuals to work on agricultural machinery, mining equipment, industrial controls. The work was real. That was intentional. If questioned, he could show drafts, revisions, corrections. He was competent, but never brilliant. Brilliance attracted attention. In the evenings, he lived like a foreigner was expected to live. He attended museums. He went to concerts. He sat alone in cafes and ordered tea. Sometimes he went days without speaking to anyone beyond basic transactions. Loneliness was part of the cover. The KGB understood loneliness. They expected it. What they watched for was deviation. Michael assumed he was being observed from the moment he arrived. His phone, if tapped, offered nothing. His mail, if opened, contained only banal correspondence. His apartment, if entered while he was away, revealed nothing incriminating. No hidden equipment, no documents, no signs of secrecy. He cleaned obsessively, not because he was neat, but because disorder suggested concealment. At night, he listened to the building, learned which doors belonged to families, which to single men, which to someone who came home late and left early. He learned the rhythm of the place. The man across the hall drank heavily. The couple upstairs argued on Thursdays. Someone on the third floor smoked constantly. Normal people left patterns. So did surveillance. By the end of summer, Michael noticed something else. The same man reading a newspaper on a bench near his metro station, twice in 1 week. A delivery van parked on his street more often than made sense. A woman in the library who always arrived shortly after he did, left shortly after he did. He did nothing. That was the hardest part. He did not change routes. He did not act cautious. He did not test them. Testing surveillance confirmed its existence. Instead, he became even more predictable. If they were watching, and he believed they were, he wanted them to be bored. 6 months passed. No confrontations. No warnings. No sudden interest. Which meant only one thing. He had passed the first test. And now, whether he wanted it or not, Moscow was beginning to accept him as something far more dangerous than a spy. A known quantity. Late 1978. The first mistake did not feel like a mistake at the time. That was what made it dangerous. By late autumn, Michael Reynolds had been in Moscow long enough to stop counting days and start measuring time by routine. The city had moved from damp gray to sharp cold. Leaves disappeared overnight. Breath turned visible again. And something subtle changed. People began to recognize him. Not in a dramatic way. No greetings. No curiosity. Just the smallest acknowledgments, an extra half-second of eye contact from the woman at the bread shop, a nod from a librarian who had never nodded before. He had become familiar. For most foreigners, that was comforting. For someone in his position, it was the edge of a blade. The moment came on an ordinary afternoon at the Lenin Library. Michael was seated at his usual desk, reviewing a Soviet technical journal on industrial automation. He was underlining phrases carefully, slowly, when a voice spoke beside him. "You are the Canadian translator." It was not a question. The man stood too close. Mid-40s. Plain suit. Not KGB plain, worse. Academic plain. The kind of person who did not expect to be noticed. Michael looked up, mildly surprised, mildly annoyed. He had practiced this expression too. "Yes," he said. "I am." The man nodded, as if confirming something already known. "I have seen you here many times," he said. "You work seriously. That, Michael noted, was not casual conversation. Soviets did not praise strangers. Not directly. Thank you, Michael replied. Nothing more. Silence stretched. The man hesitated, then extended a hand. My name is Dmitry Petrov, Institute of Applied Mathematics. Michael shook it. Firm. Brief. Michael Reynolds. They stood there for a moment longer than was comfortable. Around them, pages turned. Chairs shifted. The library breathed quietly. Then Dmitry spoke again. There may be work for you. Translation work. Technical. Michael felt the internal shift immediately. This was early. Too early. Offers like this usually came after years, not months. And when they came, they often came with consequences. I work through the State Bureau, Michael said evenly. All contracts must be official. Dmitry smiled thinly. Of course. But before paperwork, it is customary to meet. He paused. Perhaps. Tomorrow. Michael could have refused. Refusal would have been safe. But refusal would also have been noted. Instead, he nodded once. Very well. Dmitry left without another word. Michael remained seated for 15 minutes, forcing himself to keep reading the same page, even though he had memorized it already. This was the crack. Non-event. Non-explosion. A choice. That night, he did not sleep. He ran scenarios instead. A provocation. A test. A genuine request. The KGB often used intermediaries, academics, professionals, people who looked harmless. The goal was not recruitment. It was exposure. See how the foreigner reacted. See if they pushed boundaries. The next afternoon, he arrived early. The cafe near the Pushkin Museum was exactly as he remembered it. Cheap tables, chipped cups, the smell of boiled water, and old pastry. He chose a seat with a view of both the door and the street. Dmitry arrived on time. He was not alone. The second man was younger. Thin, tired eyes, hands that moved too much. This is Alexander, Dmitry said. He works with computers. Computers. The word landed with weight. Alexander spoke carefully. About translation needs. About documentation. About Western designs they struggled to understand. His frustration leaked through his restraint. He complained about bureaucracy. About outdated equipment. About how political loyalty mattered more than competence. Michael listened. He asked neutral questions. And slowly, as the hour passed, his internal assessment shifted. This was not theater. This was a man trapped inside a failing system, trying to make it work anyway. That realization carried its own danger. At the end of the meeting, Michael agreed to review the material, officially through proper channels. No promises. No urgency. As he walked back into the cold, he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel since arriving. Momentum. That night, he wrote nothing down. But in his mind, he marked the moment clearly. This was the point where survival stopped being passive. From now on, every decision would create consequences. And somewhere in Moscow, forces he could not see were now paying closer attention. 1979. Trust in Moscow did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated. After the meeting at the cafe, Michael waited. He did not follow up. He did not inquire. He did not show interest beyond what was professionally required. The documents arrived through the State Bureau exactly as promised: dry, technical, legitimate. Schematics, terminology, references to Western-designed computing systems that were years ahead of what Soviet industry could reliably reproduce. He translated them carefully. Not quickly, not too well. Competence without distinction. A month passed, then another. Only then did Alexander invite him to the institute. The building sat in the northern suburbs, a slab of gray concrete behind a fence that was more symbolic than secure. A uniformed guard checked documents with board efficiency. Inside, the corridors smelled of dust, cigarettes, and overheated electronics. This was not a secret facility, which made it valuable. Real work happened here. Michael was introduced as a translator. Nothing more. He kept his posture relaxed, his curiosity controlled. Scientists argued openly in hallways. Engineers complained loudly about broken equipment. Political slogans hung on the walls, largely ignored. The contradiction struck him immediately. Officially, This was a place of ideological certainty. In reality, it was a place of quiet doubt. Alexander worked late. So did many others. Deadlines existed only to be missed. The 5-year plans loomed over everything, abstract and punitive. Michael noticed the patterns. Who stayed late because they cared? Who stayed late because they had nowhere else to go? Who drank at lunch? Who avoided political discussions entirely? And he noticed someone else. A woman in the library. Mid-40s. Precise. Efficient. Unfriendly. Her name was Irina Sokolova. She controlled access to foreign technical journals. That meant she controlled information. At first, their interactions were transactional. Requests. Forms. Stamps. Delays. She did her job without warmth or hostility. Weeks later, something changed. Michael asked for a journal that technically should not have been available. Irina looked at the request, then at him. Then she said quietly, "It will take time." It appeared on his desk the next week. No explanation. He said nothing. Gratitude expressed too clearly could be dangerous. Months passed. Conversations grew longer. Still professional. Still cautious. One afternoon, while filing paperwork, Irina mentioned her mother. Only one sentence. "She is ill." Michael did not ask questions. He did not offer help. He remembered the sentence. 2 weeks later, during a routine conversation about document classification, he mentioned, almost as an aside, that some medications were easier to obtain through foreign contacts. He did not look at her when he said it. Silence followed. Then Irina nodded once. Nothing more. 3 days later, she approached him near the stairwell. Quietly, carefully. "Is this possible?" she asked. He answered truthfully. "It might be." The medicine arrived a week later. No money exchanged hands. No promises were made. Irina's behavior did not change immediately. If anything, she became more formal, more cautious. Trust did not explode. It crystallized. Over time, documents began appearing in his work queue that were more detailed than necessary. Marginal notes were left uncorrected. References were included that pointed toward larger research priorities. Irina never acknowledged what she was doing. Michael never asked. This was not recruitment. Not yet. It was something slower. Something heavier. A human bond forged in quiet desperation. And that, Michael knew, was both the strongest foundation and the greatest liability. Because if this ever unraveled, there would be no plausible deniability. Only consequences. 1980 to 1981. By his 3rd year in Moscow, Michael Reynolds was no longer surviving on routine alone. He was managing people. That distinction mattered. Survival depended on invisibility. People introduced gravity. Irina never said the word help. She did not need to. Documents began to surface that exceeded her job description. Internal circulation lists, annotated research summaries, procurement requests that revealed where resources were truly being directed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that screamed espionage. But together, they formed a pattern. Michael understood the danger immediately. Every page increased her risk. So he slowed things down. He refused documents by omission rather than instruction. He let some materials sit unread. He ensured nothing moved too quickly. Intelligence gathered too fast attracted attention. Intelligence gathered slowly looked like bureaucracy. That was how the system hid itself. Alexander, meanwhile, became more vocal. Not publicly, never publicly, but in private, over tea after long workdays, he spoke with bitterness about wasted years, about designs rejected for political reasons, about Western breakthroughs he read about too late. Michael listened. He did not validate. He did not argue. He let silence do the work. One evening, Alexander said something he immediately regretted. "If someone in the West knew how bad things really are here," he said, staring into his cup, "they would stop being afraid of us." Michael did not respond. He simply remembered. Recruitment, when it happened, never looked like recruitment. There was no offer, no question, no dramatic crossing of a line. It happened the night Irina's mother died. Michael learned about it not from Irina herself, but from a change in behavior. She arrived late. She left early. Her precision slipped. He waited. 3 days later, she spoke. She did not suffer, she said flatly. He nodded. She was afraid, Irina continued, that she would be forgotten. Michael paused before speaking. She wasn't, he said. Not by you. Irina looked at him for a long time. Then she asked, does any of this matter? The question was not philosophical. It was operational. Michael chose his words carefully. It matters when people understand what is real, he said. Not what they are told. That was the moment. Not because Irina agreed, but because she did not walk away. From then on, information flowed deliberately. Irina never handed him originals. Only copies. Never all at once. Never directly. She left items where he would find them naturally, in his assigned folders, among unrelated material. Alexander, on the other hand, wanted recognition. He began to talk about results, about how his work deserved acknowledgement. That made him volatile. Michael adjusted. He encouraged Alexander to focus on professional advancement within the system, not escape from it. He redirected ambition inward, away from risk. This was not manipulation for gain. It was damage control. By late 1981, Michael had 3 people quietly feeding him information. None of them knew about each other. None of them had been promised anything. That was intentional. Payment created records. Promises created expectations. Expectations created mistakes. Instead, Michael offered consistency. He showed up when expected. He listened. He did not push. And most importantly, he never acted surprised. Because surprise suggested importance. And importance was dangerous. At night, alone in his apartment, the weight settled in. These were not assets. They were people. If he failed, they would not be recalled. They would be erased. And Moscow did not erase gently. He understood then that the mission had shifted. This was no longer about gathering intelligence and leaving. It was about maintaining balance. Too little activity meant wasted risk. Too much meant collapse. Somewhere in the middle was survival. And survival, Michael knew, required restraint as much as courage. By his 4th year, Michael Reynolds had begun to understand the invisible architecture of Moscow's surveillance. The city was no longer a maze. It was a network of patterns, signals, and rotations he had memorized. Every uniformed officer, every janitor, every delivery van was a potential observer. Even the shadows seemed alive, shifting subtly with movement he had learned to anticipate. One spring morning, he felt it for the first time as a tangible pressure, the sense that someone had noticed him. He was on the metro, sitting near the rear doors, notebook hidden beneath his jacket, reviewing technical schematics he had copied the night before. Across the aisle, a man in a dark overcoat held the handrail, pretending to read a newspaper. The folds of the paper did not align naturally. His eyes flicked up with unnatural regularity. Michael froze, calculating. The rules of tradecraft were simple in theory, but infinitely complex in practice. Change nothing. Do nothing unusual. Breathe evenly. Yet every step, every gesture was under scrutiny. He adjusted his bag slightly, feigned reading interest, and watched the man. 3 stops later, the man exited. Michael exhaled quietly. No words were exchanged. No gestures made. But the encounter left a mark. Surveillance was constant, and mistakes were measured in seconds. Back in his apartment, the psychological toll manifested in subtle ways. The ceiling tiles appeared to sag. Every creak in the building echoed like a warning. A neighbor's cough could signal a hidden informant. He found himself double-checking locks, scanning the courtyard through the narrow kitchen window, counting footsteps in the hallway. Each evening, he documented his observations in a plain notebook, coded in mundane language. The notes both a shield and a map of invisible threats. His assets, too, were increasingly vulnerable. Irina's nervous glances suggested she sensed attention from someone outside her immediate workspace. Michael altered their routines, smaller exchanges, staggered schedules, and rotated drop points. Alexander became careless once, leaving notes in an envelope he believed hidden. Michael intercepted them, shredded the documents, and redirected Alexander's frustration by assigning him tedious but safe tasks. Despite constant vigilance, life in Moscow occasionally revealed moments of normalcy. On rare weekends, he walked along the Moskva River, observing the pale sunlight on its murky waters, the sounds of children feeding swans, the faint hum of distant traffic. He noted these details not for nostalgia, but for survival. Familiarity bred subtle control, allowing him to distinguish ordinary urban rhythm from surveillance. The turning point of this period came unexpectedly. A courier assigned by Langley to pick up a package failed to arrive. Michael had followed every precaution. The dead drop was untraceable, the signal subtle. Yet, the absence triggered a chain of recalculations. Had the courier been observed? Was the drop compromised? He spent the next 48 hours in near total isolation, refraining from public movements, reviewing schedules, testing each asset for potential exposure. Eventually, the risk proved imaginary, but the anxiety revealed the high cost of constant vigilance. Mistakes, even imagined, had a weight. They compounded, creating fatigue that could be fatal. Michael adjusted his approach. Less improvisation, more rigid patterns within variability. Every action, every encounter became a carefully calculated equation of risk and reward. By the end of 1983, Michael's network had grown to 5 reliable contributors. Each was compartmentalized. Each carried a small but critical piece of the intelligence puzzle. Their cooperation depended not on coercion or payment, but on trust, discretion, and Michael's ability to protect them from invisible eyes. Every document delivered, every detail observed, was proof of both skill and restraint. And yet, the psychological cost was accumulating. Sleep became fragmented, dreams invaded by scenarios of discovery. Paranoia mingled with awareness in a delicate balance. He began journaling not just operations, but reflections on fear, trust, and morality, the human dimension of espionage. Moscow, in all its grayness and cold, had become both a canvas for survival and a mirror reflecting the vulnerability of every human life he touched. In this period, Michael learned that mastery of espionage was not merely about information. It was about patience, empathy, and restraint. Knowledge alone could not protect him. Understanding the human element, the emotional and ethical contours of those around him, became the most critical weapon of all. 1984 to 1985. By 1984, Michael Reynolds had lived in Moscow for 6 years. The initial novelty of survival had long since given way to a persistent, grinding awareness of the dangers around him. Every conversation, every step outside, carried potential consequences measured not only in days or weeks, but in the possible lifetime of those he had come to protect. The city's monotony masked its lethal precision. One wrong move could unravel years of careful planning. That year, subtle shifts in the Soviet political landscape created both opportunities and tension. New policies of economic reform and bureaucratic restructuring introduced irregularities in access and reporting. Some departments were now more disorganized, opening unexpected channels for intelligence collection, while others tightened controls in reaction to perceived risks. Michael sensed the system was simultaneously fragile and resilient, a contradiction that demanded constant recalibration. One particular incident marked a turning point. He had arranged a drop at a public park near the Pushkin Institute, a location meticulously scouted months earlier. The courier approached, a man whose face Michael had memorized and whose gestures were precise, yet something seemed off. The man hesitated, scanning the surrounding area with unusual intensity. Michael froze mid-step, counting seconds and noting every movement of passers-by. When the drop was finally completed, the courier vanished into the crowd, leaving Michael shaken. He returned home and ran exhaustive counter-surveillance exercises, mapping the incident against known KGB routines. The outcome: no compromise had occurred, but the margin for error had never been thinner. In addition to operational pressures, human factors increasingly shaped his work. One asset, a mid-level engineer named Yuri, began exhibiting signs of stress. Missed appointments, nervous glances, erratic work habits. Michael carefully assessed whether these changes were personal, circumstantial, or indicative of external surveillance. His years of experience had taught him that panic or overreaction could endanger both the mission and the asset. He approached Yuri indirectly, offering advice and assistance without revealing any operational details. Gradually, trust was rebuilt, and the engineer resumed his contributions. Michael's routine, though outwardly ordinary, had become a sophisticated choreography. He varied his commute routes, staggered meal times, rotated safe houses, and altered his reading and translation schedules. Even seemingly trivial interactions, chatting with a neighbor, ordering tea at a corner cafe, were measured for behavioral deviations that might indicate observation. His life was a constant calculus of presence and absence, visibility and concealment. Amid this calculated vigilance, moments of human connection provided rare solace. A colleague from the Translation Bureau shared anecdotes of Moscow's oddities. A fellow foreigner offered companionship over tea, and brief exchanges with trusted assets reinforced the fragile bonds of loyalty. These interactions, though superficial in appearance, were carefully managed reservoirs of emotional support, sustaining him against the isolation imposed by deep cover. By late 1984, Michael had solidified a network of 8 reliable assets, each compartmentalized and contributing unique intelligence. The information flow was steady. Industrial data, personnel records, procurement schedules, and technical manuals that illuminated both Soviet capability and limitation. Collectively, the network allowed Michael to provide comprehensive reports to Langley, demonstrating both operational success and strategic value. Yet the psychological toll was undeniable. Sleep remained elusive, dreams a tangle of hypothetical exposures. The line between professional vigilance and personal anxiety blurred. He began practicing subtle, grounding techniques, slow walks in unmonitored streets, attentive observation of mundane urban details, small acts of kindness toward those unaware of his identity. These were not luxuries, but survival tools, helping him maintain mental equilibrium in a city designed to observe and intimidate. As the year closed, Michael recognized that he had entered the final phase of what he could endure operationally without major misstep. The KGB's persistent, though imperfect, surveillance meant that each decision had amplified stakes. Yet the foundations of his network were now resilient, built on trust, patience, and the careful management of human and logistical variables. His life, though shadowed, had achieved a level of stability that made him almost invisible, a ghost among the crowds, gathering intelligence while remaining unseen. By this point, Michael understood a fundamental truth of espionage in hostile territory. Survival depended as much on psychological mastery and empathy as on technical skill. Information alone could not protect him. Understanding the human currents around him, the fears, hopes, and vulnerabilities, was the ultimate safeguard. 1985 to 1986. By 1985, Moscow had grown familiar in ways that were both comforting and suffocating for Michael Reynolds. The streets, the gray Krushko apartments, the metal gates of government buildings, they all spoke a language of surveillance he had learned to read fluently. Yet familiarity was dangerous. Complacency was a spy's enemy. Every day, he reminded himself that 8 years of survival required constant recalibration. It was during this period that an unexpected opportunity arrived. A defector. Pavel Sorokin, a mid-level KGB officer responsible for monitoring Western operatives, approached through a series of covert signals indicating a willingness to cooperate. The very notion was staggering. Someone from the heart of the enemy's security apparatus, risking everything to share intelligence. Michael did not react with blind optimism. He approached the situation with methodical caution. 3 months were spent verifying Pavel's story, testing the information he provided, observing inconsistencies, and cross-referencing with other sources. One wrong assumption could compromise the entire network and cost lives. Pavel's intelligence was both detailed and actionable. He confirmed long-standing suspicions, intermittent KGB surveillance of Michael's activities, internal assessments of Western influence, and lists of Soviet citizens cooperating with foreign operatives. The revelation was chilling. For years, Michael had assumed he was invisible, but the margin of safety had been narrower than he had imagined. One misstep could have led to arrest or worse. Yet Pavel's cooperation also created possibilities. Michael could now safeguard assets more effectively, adjust dead drops, and eliminate vulnerabilities previously invisible. The network he had built, which had required years of patient cultivation, could now operate with an added layer of security. He began meticulously revising operational procedures, reinforcing protocols, and providing indirect guidance to assets without drawing attention. The partnership with Pavel also illuminated the human dimension of espionage. Here was a man, indoctrinated and trained to be ruthless, making a moral choice that risked execution. Michael understood the stakes. Each act of trust, each revelation, carried immense personal risk. He treated Pavel not only as an intelligence asset, but as a human being navigating fear, ideology, and survival. In operational terms, Michael now managed his network with even greater compartmentalization. Assets were rotated more frequently, communication channels diversified, and dead drops relocated based on Pavel's insights. He leveraged the KGB officer's knowledge to anticipate surveillance patterns and avoid exposure. Every step was measured, every decision scrutinized. Even as operations stabilized, psychological strain intensified. The constant awareness that the enemy had eyes everywhere, combined with the responsibility for the lives of those assisting him, created a persistent tension. Sleep was interrupted, often by dreams of exposure, interrogation, or the loss of trusted individuals. Michael adopted small routines of mental grounding, memorizing trivial details of the city, observing daily urban rhythms, finding brief solace in mundane tasks to manage the stress. Amid these pressures, the city itself continued to shift. Gorbachev's early reforms introduced unpredictability. Some bureaucracies loosened their control, offering fleeting intelligence opportunities, while others reacted with sudden, rigid measures. The paradox required constant vigilance and adaptive strategies. By the end of 1985, Michael's network was stronger than ever, his operational discipline sharper, and his awareness of both the environment and human dynamics unparalleled. The defector had transformed potential vulnerability into strategic advantage, proving that even in the heart of a repressive state, careful human connections could alter outcomes. He recognized that the window for the network's maximum productivity was finite. Each day brought new risks, and the political landscape suggested that the balance between opportunity and danger was tipping. He began preparing for a future exfiltration, all while ensuring that the ongoing intelligence operations continued uninterrupted. In the shadows of Moscow, Michael Reynolds had learned a crucial lesson. The survival of a spy depended not just on skill, but on empathy, patience, and the ability to navigate human uncertainty with precision. The stakes had never been higher, and every decision mattered, not just for him, but for the lives intertwined with his mission. 1986. By early 1986, Michael Reynolds had spent nearly 8 years embedded deep within the Soviet capital. Every street corner, every metro station, every Krushka corridor held memories of vigilance and calculated risk. Yet the approaching end of his assignment carried its own tension. The city had become both home and trap, a place where survival depended as much on routine as on improvisation. The political climate was shifting. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika had begun to loosen the rigid structures of Soviet bureaucracy, creating cracks in a system that had once seemed impenetrable. Offices were quieter in some areas, officials less meticulous, and whispers of dissent more audible. For Michael, these changes were a double-edged sword. Opportunities to gather intelligence grew, but so did the potential for unpredictable interference. The KGB's paranoia remained, perhaps even heightened, as it sensed the foundations of control starting to erode. Michael began planning his exit without alerting even his closest assets. Each step required the utmost discretion. Dead drops were re-evaluated, communications minimized, and escape routes rehearsed mentally. His team of assets, librarians, engineers, translators, remained active, but Michael limited direct contact, relying on prearranged signals and carefully timed exchanges. Operationally, the network was at its peak. The intelligence flowing to Langley was comprehensive. Technical documents, personnel rosters, budget analyses, and subtle indicators of shifting priorities within Soviet scientific and military projects. Each piece, mundane in isolation, when assembled, painted a vivid picture of systemic weaknesses and strategic vulnerabilities. The CIA analysts were impressed by the precision and reliability of his work. Amid the operational demands, Michael maintained the delicate human connections that had sustained his network. Irina, the librarian who had become his first asset, continued to provide critical documents. Victor, the engineer denied immigration, remained a source of technical insight. Each person had been carefully cultivated, their motivations understood, their loyalty earned through empathy, discretion, and shared purpose. The psychological dimension of his espionage was as important as any operational tactic. As the final months approached, Michael began orchestrating the exfiltration process. He rehearsed the sequence of events in his mind: departure from his apartment, clearing of all traces, coordination with assets to continue operations with new handlers, and the discreet transfer of information already gathered. Every detail had contingencies, because one small misstep could unravel years of careful work. The psychological toll was profound. Living under an assumed identity for so long had created a permanent hypervigilance. Every conversation, every glance, every incidental observation carried potential consequences. He often walked the streets at night, not to gather intelligence, but to ground himself in the rhythm of the city he had learned so well. These moments were both reflective and somber, filled with memories of successes and losses. Michael also reflected on the cost to his assets. Some had been arrested or disappeared, victims of the unforgiving Soviet system. Others had survived, but at great personal risk. He carried a quiet responsibility for their fates, understanding that while intelligence was his profession, human lives were the ultimate stakes. The final weeks were meticulous. Dead drops were completed, secure channels closed, and assets briefed on emergency protocols. Michael cleaned his apartment as a mundane resident might, leaving no indication of the extraordinary activities that had occurred within those walls. The Krushka, once a symbol of confinement and caution, became a place of careful finality. On the day of his departure, Michael walked through Moscow one last time. The city appeared unchanged, yet he saw it with a different awareness. Every monument, every boulevard, every surveillance post memorized and accounted for. He felt a mixture of relief, melancholy, and gratitude. 8 years of living on the edge, 8 years of invisibility, were concluding not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet, precise planning. As he boarded the flight out of Moscow, Michael Reynolds understood the duality of his existence. He had survived, contributed valuable intelligence, and protected those who trusted him, but he had also paid a personal price: hypervigilance, isolation, and the weight of ethical responsibility that would accompany him for the rest of his life. The city receded beneath the clouds, leaving behind memories, allies, and the shadows of an 8-year life spent entirely in the service of a mission that few would ever comprehend. 1986 to 1987. Michael Reynolds' final days in Moscow were a study in quiet precision. After nearly 8 years under constant surveillance, operating in the shadows of a city that had become both his battleground and his prison, he now faced the delicate task of leaving without drawing attention. Every movement, every gesture, every interaction was scrutinized, not by the KGB, but by years of ingrained discipline and instinct. He began by methodically winding down his network. Dead drops were completed, communications channels securely terminated, and assets given instructions for maintaining operational security in his absence. Irina, Victor, and the remaining trusted contacts received discreet signals indicating that new handlers would take over. The relationships he had cultivated over the years, built on trust, empathy, and shared purpose, were left in capable hands. Yet the emotional burden remained. He had grown to care for these people, and though their loyalty was earned, he knew the stakes for them had never been higher. His apartment in the Novojarivo Krushka became a place of final reflection. Each object, each piece of furniture, each book held memories of long nights of coding messages, analyzing technical documents, and rehearsing contingencies. The modest living room, which had doubled as workspace, was emptied and cleaned with meticulous care, leaving no trace of the clandestine operations that had occurred within its walls. The smell of old tobacco, the faint scent of bread from neighbors' kitchens, the rhythmic hum of Moscow life. These details, once mundane, now held profound significance. On the day of departure, Michael moved through the city with the awareness of someone leaving a world he had known intimately, yet could never fully call home. The metro stations, the park benches, the sidewalks, all familiar, all part of the choreography of survival that had defined him. He paused briefly in Gorky Park, sitting on the same bench where Dmitry Petrov had first approached him years ago. The autumn leaves, turning gold against the gray concrete of the city, reminded him that time had passed quietly, relentlessly. His exit was seamless. Posing as Michael Reynolds, the Canadian translator, he presented his paperwork, collected his luggage, and boarded the flight without incident. Yet as the Aeroflot plane ascended, the familiar skyline of Moscow shrinking beneath him, a mix of relief, melancholy, and unresolved responsibility filled him. He had survived 8 years in the heart of enemy territory, protected his network, and delivered invaluable intelligence. But the emotional and psychological cost was immeasurable. Landing in London for a final debriefing, Michael recounted every detail to analysts: operational procedures, asset assessments, KGB surveillance techniques, and the lessons learned from years of maintaining deep cover. The information he provided would shape CIA operations for decades, informing training programs and field protocols, ensuring that future operatives could navigate hostile environments with greater awareness and preparedness. Returning to the United States in January 1987, he faced the challenge of reintegration. The transition from hypervigilant operative to civilian life was disorienting. The quiet streets of Virginia, the warmth of a safe home, the mundane interactions with colleagues, all felt alien. Therapy and counseling helped him manage the lasting effects of constant vigilance, isolation, and moral responsibility. Over time, he found solace in sharing lessons with a new generation of intelligence officers, guiding them through the nuances of tradecraft, operational patience, and ethical decision-making. Yet the emotional imprint of Moscow never fully faded. He carried memories of colleagues and assets who had risked everything, of moments where one wrong decision could have ended lives, and of the constant tension between duty and humanity. In the quiet moments, he reflected on the sacrifices made, the courage displayed by ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, and the profound truth that intelligence work was rarely glamorous, always dangerous, and morally complex. Michael Morrison passed away quietly years later, leaving behind a legacy of courage, discipline, and humanity. His work, largely invisible to the public, shaped history, influenced the outcome of the Cold War, and set a standard for professionalism and ethical responsibility in the intelligence community. The story of his 8 years in Moscow is not one of cinematic drama or spy thriller heroics. It is a story of patience, vigilance, and human endurance, a testament to the quiet, meticulous, and extraordinary work done by those who operate in the shadows to protect the freedoms of others. As you consider the quiet bravery of operatives like Michael Morrison, ask yourself, how far would you go to protect truth, freedom, and the lives of those who trust you, even when no one knows your name? If this story moved you, and you want to uncover more untold histories from the shadows of global conflicts, subscribe to Blood Litany for more cinematic, real-world intelligence narratives.